All right, thanks guys for coming along to my talk. Really appreciate you guys coming along and being here. So this is my talk on the drop in the tide of enterprise. I really want to kind of like talk to you guys today about what Drupal is in the enterprise, and actually I want to talk a little bit as well about how we got there, and I think that this morning's keynote was kind of really on point as well in terms of remaining relevant, which is another kind of topic that this talk's going to highlight. So just to give you a little bit of background, if you don't know who I am, my name is Josh Waihi. I work for Acquia, and I've been a part of the Drupal community since about 2007. Large scale Drupal is really kind of the thing I like. I've worked with loads of like news and media and large enterprise customers working Drupal applications and solving those hard, difficult problems at scale. So high volume, high storage, high complexity, that type of work. And I've done that predominantly in a technical space, right? So I'm a technical account manager at Acquia. I help with those enterprises solve those complex problems and become successful at implementing their technical challenges. And that's that type of role is one where we do a lot of enablement that flows on through into delivery, things like continuous integration and high velocity teams, and then finally into sort of more mature aspects of technology, which is generally around strategy. But today I want to talk to you a bunch about enterprises. So large enterprises are kind of like these post-chasm early adopters of go-to-market technologies. They often fund industry advancement, and those innovations that they get, the rest of the market looks at, figures out cheaper ways of doing it, and then it trickles down into the lower parts of the industry, so mid-market and small and medium businesses. So they often have these kind of like bespoke, interesting ideas that people want to try out. They're on the cuff, they're on the edge sometimes. Other times they're actually late adopters, right? And they're picking up things once they've finally matured at a level that you can implement at the enterprise. But before we kind of really get into it, I want to take you guys through a bit of history around Drupal. Go sort of, flashback Fridays as it was. Drupal really started back in 2001. If you've ever been to a DrupalCon, you'll know the story about Dries in his dormitory creating a forum in PHP and then eventually open sourcing it. Back then, right? So if you think about the origin story of Drupal and its value system, if you look at what happened in the enterprise back in 2001, when we were delivering software into enterprises, it was a very much an on-premise sort of setup, right? So everyone was getting their own servers, putting them in, creating IT capabilities, and getting IT staff to manage your own IT infrastructure. That was kind of like the thing. At that time, all of those big software giants were selling perpetual licensing agreements with those companies, and that's how the sort of the money making was happening. The UX and the intelligence systems were constrained because it's 2001. Loads of stuff hasn't happened yet, and the growth engine for all of that is sales. So basically, selling in services to get a lot of that work done. Drupal's value in that time, or its sort of potential really, because obviously adoption hadn't really taken place at that time, was really a DIY sort of setup. So if you wanted to use Drupal, often it was sort of a hobbyist or enthusiast getting involved, and then you would either sort of do it. You found Drupal online and you would bring it into your company and bring it up, and that was kind of adequate enough level of capability to make something happen at a business level, or you would get a dev shop who just sort of said, hey, we can make some money out of this and maybe do this for other businesses. Because Drupal as well from a UX and intelligence standpoint, like sort of match that well. So it's both generic and constrained. It can do its own thing. I was talking to some people about this talk over the course of the week, and someone mentioned to me the original artificial intelligence, which of course is Clippy, the Office 97 little paperclip that sat in the bottom of your screen and gave you little tooltips and knocked on your screen. And of course that was a constrained user experience. There was no real sort of big data there to say, I'm going to have issues if I don't go from slide to slide fast enough. Cool. All right, so moving on. Also for FYI, in 2001, We had Dre's Chronic album, which brought Eminem to the world for the first time. We had Windows XP come upon us, and now that it's fully gone, we can look back and go, oh. And Windows OS X, the Unix Millennium, the 10-digit Unix timestamp happened then. The iPod came out, 9/11 happened, and we had Wikipedia. So some pretty interesting things happened for us in the world back in 2001. Shortly after that, we have the Drupal progression, right? Most of us don't really remember the 1.x through to the 4.x time zone, right? Like that was kind of like this real big development stage where the community was incredibly small at the time. And then around that sort of 2005, 2007, we started really picking up momentum. I got involved in 2007, started building with Drupal 5 sites. Drupal 6 came out, and then in 2011, we saw Drupal 7 come out, and that was kind of like this really, now things were getting really excited inside of the Drupal community because we were improving on the CMS a whole bunch, so the community was really growing at that time. Also of interest, Steve Jobs and Osama bin Laden died that year. We had a 9.0 earthquake in Japan at the same time as DrupalCon in Chicago, where kind of the Drupal 7 announcement was taking place. The world population hit 7 billion at that time, and 13% of Kiwis had a smartphone in 2011. And it's kind of funny to think that now, right? Because everyone has one, everyone here will have one. And it's kind of a bit of a reality check about what Drupal was doing up until this point, which was that we weren't doing mobile. In fact, I remember in 2011, that was kind of the time where the App Store was really going through its billion, it was making $1 billion. You'd make a little app, you'd sell it for $1, and you get back $3 million because 3 million people had downloaded it, and people were just making loads of money. We were like, man, where's Drupal in all of this, right? And we had our first sort of crisis where we were like, how do we remain mobile, relevant in a mobile world? And we were trying to figure all that out. And of course, the response to that was responsive websites. At the same time, we also had the first time ever that we had a look at the marketing technology landscape. So a company called Chief Martech since 2011 have started producing these infographics. And these infographics are to describe what all the technology stack looks like in the marketing industry. Now, why this is really interesting is the marketing people, if you've ever talked to them, are not technologists. They're not really tech-savvy people, most of them. In fact, they're more sort of content-driven kind of people, and so they speak a different language. And this infographic came out of this obvious thing that was happening where the marketing world needed to be more tech-savvy to be able to do its job. And this was to illustrate the complex nature that they had upon them, not as technologists, but as content strategists, to try and figure out what set of logos they need to be able to do their job. And that looks pretty complex, right? Drupal's there, by the way. It's right in the middle in the core website space. So we were even inside that graphic back in 2011. And Acquia was there as well in the communities, if you can spot it. And so how did we end up responding to this kind of demand, right? There was a growing landscape. We recognized that. How did the Drupal community really respond? And the answer was modules, right? The saying that there's a module for that was the way that we answered that question. As of this month, so I did a crawl of Drupal.org on the 13th, we have over nearly 3,000 modules stable in the Drupal 7 community. And that represents 67% of the total modules that are available, but 3,000 is pretty substantial, right? So we absolutely created this sort of Drupal can do that mentality, and we started writing modules that integrate Drupal to do all of these different things. And so Drupal really stopped actually being a CMS in some ways. Like when I joined Acquia, I was kind of surprised that we were just doing CMS stuff. Because, when my previous job at Catalyst, we were doing all kinds of stuff with Drupal. It was an intranet, it was an administration user interface. We didn't really, like the CMS part of it, just driving websites was just kind of like a, oh, that's cool. We're just using it for user authentication or something like that. So yeah, Drupal had actually a really wide application, and even though the landscape was already big, right, it was still really immature. So we were able to say, oh yeah, look, we just take this system. It's already got user management. It's already got content management inside of it. Why don't we just tack on the bit that you need, and we'll say we'll call that commerce. And we were kind of okay with that because the other alternative wasn't that much better, right? It was pay a $20,000 license and you get nothing for it. So it was kind of like a business model that worked really well. Since then, things have also been changing a lot in our movement. So, we would, I guess back in 2011, we'd have a lot of dev shops that would bring up their own servers, and they would do a bit of hosting. So, your business model might look like I sell you some services to build a site, and then I sell you hosting ongoing year on year, and a bit of support to go along with that. And over the last, say, 4 or 5 years, that landscape started to change quite significantly, right? So this is a survey conducted by Gartner, I think, looking at the usage of computing power over the last few years, right? So you can see that there's a direct increase in cloud, right? And it represents 37% of the industry at the moment. Still quite a lot of self-hosted stuff going on, but cloud's absolutely growing. And on that are a bunch of new businesses that are all 100% cloud-based. So there's actually been quite a number of disruptors that are now making their way into the industry, and we're all kind of aware of what those things are. So cloud platform is definitely one of them. Drupal hasn't really been sort of disrupted by that, but it might have disrupted your business model, right? If you used to host Drupal sites, and now you use another hosting provider to host those Drupal sites instead because it's economically more feasible, or they can do a better job of it than you can, then yeah, cloud platforming has kind of disrupted you in some form or fashion. And you've kind of been okay with that because you can still build Drupal sites, right? And that's really where your core business is, so you kind of lean towards that. Mobile has been another one, right? Like, so everyone kind of said, oh, we need to have an app and go to the app store, but then we quickly realized that no one wants to download every app in the world onto their phones, and so that kind of market's really sort of chilled out, you could say, which is a good thing. So it hasn't been as much of a disruptor as we would have expected, but it's definitely driving a lot of demand for mobility in the way that we deliver content and responsiveness. And of course, responsive frameworks have come out. There's loads of devices now. How do you do cross-browser testing? We thought that IE6 was bad. Now you've got like so many different phones, so many different browsers, so many different kinds of devices. There's actually no realistic way that you can actually test that everything works in every device that your customers care about. Big data, machine learning, AI, those are also some really big things that we did not have an answer for, right? As a community, we weren't like, oh yeah, MySQL can just handle that data, and we can with our relational database, we can do some really great analysis and give you some really valuable information back. No, we can't really deal with that big data at all. We don't have a mechanism for storing it, we have a mechanism for querying it, and so we've just kind of stayed out of that market. And at the beginning, it didn't matter because it was little data, and it's accumulated over time, and now people are doing some really interesting stuff with it, and they're able to do some really interesting personalization tasks, and like we're noticing now that people who are big data holders are starting to be the power players in the market. And we were completely out of that game. There's no place for us in there, but our customers want it, and so we end up going and buying other off-the-shelf products to be able to do that. Internet of Things is another one. So I think Preston's keynote this morning is just like bang on the money there, right? So there's so many different technologies that don't even require a website, still require content, but there's this whole new economy coming upon us, and it's not based around websites. This is a graph of 2 surveys conducted in 2012, 2015, asking IT managers, what are your top 3 concerns, right? And so if you look at these things, you've got obviously data security is a big one. We'll go through all of them, but basically if you look at 2012 and then 2015, and you think about the differences in cloud technology in 2012 versus 2015, it explains a lot of what's happening in this movement of this graph. So if you take data security, right, a lot of people thought, I can't handle my data securely. I don't know what I'm doing, right? But then if they kind of think, if I hand it over to somebody else who's dedicated at their job, they can do a better job of it, right? So if a lot of people who have gone to the cloud for their solutions have reduced their data security risks, assuming that it's at the right security levels. There's a lot more uncertainty around the cost and savings. So back when you had to buy your own hardware and host it inside your own organization, that was a high cost. You had to have your own IT managers, and you didn't really know how much you were saving versus just doing productivity the way it used to be done. Now where you go to an Office 365 model, you know exactly how much that's costing you year on year. It's actually quite accurate to understand the value that you're getting versus the cost of that product. Loss of control, so there's been a lot that's happening in that space to be able to deliver administrative capabilities to IT managers, so that's reduced a whole lot. But then right down the other side, you get things like lock-in. So now SaaS products are lock-in products, even though they may not necessarily be licensed products. You put your data in there, and it's kind of hard to get away from it. It's not so much a data problem anymore. It's like my business is so productive on that I don't know how to move my business off to something else, more economical, more feature-friendly, and the cost of business can be kind of huge. At Acquia, we've recently gone through we started off hosting our own IRC chat channels internally. Then we moved over to Atlassian's HitChat. Now we're running Slack. And every time that we've done that, it's been a huge disruption to business as we've had to rebuild bots. We've had to do new campaigns. People love their old IRC client. They don't want to use the HipChat one. There's all these kinds of cultural issues that you have to try and migrate teams of people through every single time. Sort of problematic. The interesting thing about this graph, though, is that when we're thinking about it from a Drupal shop perspective, is that as a Drupal shop building a website, you pretty much don't address any of the top 3 concerns that IT managers have. And the bar for doing these things, like regulatory compliance, gets really difficult, right? How do you have the resources to go through the PCI compliance spec and know that you're building accordingly to that, or your accessibility specs, or IRAP assessment, FedRAMP? There's so many of these different ISO standards that are incredibly difficult to accomplish. It means that the bar gets really high, and it's kind of hard for you. You've got to essentially lean on other people to be able to do that for you. So in 2017, the landscape's kind of changed a little bit, right? So our delivery method is more cloud-based, SaaS kind of producting, because there are just this microservices economy of pulling in the different types of SaaS services that we need. That's kind of how things are now. Pricing is a subscription model. It's not licensing anymore. And that's kind of a bit of a pressure point on Drupal's open source model. We used to say, oh, you don't have to pay for licensing, so that's great. Drupal's sort of free as and bare to that end. But actually, inside of an enterprise model, you still need the support, right? So you're still buying some kind of subscription. It still costs you money to do Drupal, right? And the market has adjusted to that. So they're no longer doing licensing. They're actually just doing subscriptions, and it's actually on par with the open source model. But the UX and the intelligence has really changed significantly now. So the keynote from yesterday was saying that the future is personalized, and that's totally true. So the UX is a personalized experience, but it's a lot more than just having a navigation on the left or the right hand side of your device. It's actually content personalization, and being able to understand who your customer is and how they differentiate from every other customer that you have, and then giving them the right type of content that they want. Preston's example this morning of going through the airport, having the specific, knowing exactly which plane that you're going on, and being able to use that to really create a really tailored journey through the airport is the kind of experiences that we want in this industry today, which was just not existent back in 2001 or 2011. And so the growth engine's really changed now to sort of a products-based consumer business. And Drupal's kind of changed a little bit, so it's still generic and constrained, right? So we haven't, as I mentioned before, we haven't really moved in that area, and our community is not really our growth engine anymore. Back in 2001, 2011, we were really a dev-strong community. That's how we grew, and we realized that to continue growing, we needed to adopt other people into our community. So we got front-end people, we got content people, we got end users, and we got accessibility, and all these kinds of different people and personas, and we got them working together in a bigger community. So we really grew the community out. We kind of did it, right? I don't know that what the next endeavor would be to continue growing that community. Our growth engine actually changes now to adoption and being able to get to the market to be really seeing Drupal as the key leader and wanting to use that in every sense. But this is the landscape today. So I saw, I showed you the 2011 snapshot a few slides ago. This is now called the Martech 5000. It's actually capped at 5,000. So they can't put any more people inside the graph. If you can spot Drupal, it's still there somewhere down the bottom. And Akwe's still in there somewhere. But the job that marketing had back in 2011 has just gotten way worse now, and the industry is so much more fragmented now. So it means that that a customer comes to you and says, "Here's our vision. Here's the thing that we want to do," and it actually means that you're now talking to 30 other different integrations. And Drupal's there's a module for that kind of mentality has really changed a bit. It's no longer like there's a module for that just does it. There's more like there's a module that integrates with that. So it's more like there's a SaaS provider that now does that functionality better than the community has done, and you're better off just integrating with that than actually writing the functionality, because it's so complex. There's just simply not enough money in it to be able to realistically do that work. And so this is kind of what we have today. We have Drupal 8, which has only got a 41% share of stable modules inside of it, still maturing. That 41% though is only 1,500 modules, opposed to Drupal 7's 3,000. So it's actually a much smaller market share. Now you might say, well, Drupal Core's got a lot more in it, right? And it absolutely does. But does that actually mean that you need 1,500 less modules because of the changes that went into Core? I'm not sure I completely agree with that. In fact, I know that in doing the enterprise projects that I've done inside Acquia with enterprise customers for the past 2 years, there have been loads of modules that are still in that alpha and beta state, and they're just not really ready for us to kind of use yet. And when we're talking about these enterprises who are looking for stuff that's ready for the market, right? They don't want to take on the risk of unstable modules. I mean, I'll give you a great example, use case example where we're working with a dev shop, used content moderation out of Core, right? While it was still unstable and alpha, experimental. Turned it on for a customer. Great workflow was working, and then the APIs change, right? Because it's an alpha module, and so they can do updates and they can break them because they said they would, which is absolutely fine. But by that stage, the dev house had left the engagement, and the customer was left with a broken site. Now, we're kind of, as a Drupal community and a bunch of dev shops, very comfortable with working with dev modules, alpha modules, beta modules, unstable stuff. We're happy with upgrading them. But once they actually sit inside an enterprise and you're not there anymore to support them, they actually need stuff that is going to continue to be stable and resilient. So this is a real concern to the enterprise at the moment. I think we're still maturing, right? So we're not like kind of feature complete yet. But there are some other things happening in our ecosystem at the moment that give us some concern for really stabilizing this up. Over between 2010 up to 2017, we've actually seen companies shift the way that they resource. So we used to be a very developer-centric industry, and now it's moving more to a front-end centric industry. There's a lot more, and I think the keynote from day one talking about a lot more complexity going on in the front end is very true, and that's kind of reflective of what's going on here. But it's also meaning that back-end development is getting less focus and less time being put into it. And so for a CMS that is essentially a back-end one, that means that we're going to kind of get less resources looking into it. I know I'm kind of painting a bit of a doomsday picture here, but there is some cool slides coming. But it does mean that the shift is focus is the focus is shifting, and that's for two reasons. One, front end's getting more exciting, right? There's other things going there, so developers naturally want to go there. But two, we are kind of actually getting close to feature complete. We are kind of getting, once the enterprises start adopting Drupal, it's like they're at the top of the Fortune 500. So once they're there, what else do you need, right? What other kind of interesting things do you need to really make or complete your CMS? They've already put us in a box. They know exactly what they want to do with us. So what else do we need to do? So we're kind of saying, well, we're actually getting to that level of maturity where there's not a whole lot more development that's really needed, which is kind of good. But if we go back to the fact that we're still lacking some stability in our Drupal 8 module set, then actually it is also a bit of a concern, because we've got to kind of figure out how to get that to feature completion before the resources really diminish. So some sort of summarizing things here is I'm basically saying I think we're over the bell curve of the adoption curve, right? We're now in sort of the late stage adopters phase, which sometimes enterprises are of that nature. So technology landscape is growing exponentially, but the CMS growth is growing much slower. So in recent keynotes from Dries, he mentioned CMS industry is now growing about 3% year over year, opposed to a lot of other industries in the broader landscape that are growing at sort of 7 to 14%. So we're the saturation point's kind of being hit. That means that there's actually less capital expenditure now going into CMS projects, because that same amount of budget is now being spread across a lot more landscape. So there is definitely this expectation that the CMS has to be already feature complete, and you're going to get, because it doesn't need as much money as it did back in 2011. The outsourcing to SaaS for big data, machine learning, AI, right? We have to do that if the customer wants it, because we just can't provide that capability, and that's obviously creating a loss of revenue for you. And then the scale, stability, and support and compliance or hosting is diminishing ROI and DIY setups. So, really, what does that mean? Like, what is a Drupal Dev Shop business model today? As I kind of guess what the point that I'm getting to, and it's for the most part kind of just building out the Drupal sites, but I don't think it's, I don't think the future is personalized websites. I think it's more akin to what Preston was talking about today, and that's what leads me towards talking a bit more about the enterprise. This is kind of the landscape that as I kind of see it the logos that are up here are just more suggestive than sort of factual. But just to kind of give you an illustration. So those three circles there represent the small to medium business, the mid-market, and the enterprise. So those are the kind of like the three different sizes of industry that you can work inside of. Back in 2011 or 2007 when I started, the small to medium business market was, you could also think of that as a hobbyist area. None of those players really operated in that space. It was more open source. It was Joomla, WordPress, Drupal, those kind of hobbyists that would really dominate in that area. Today, they're not there at all. They're because it's actually so much cheaper just to go and get a site from a website. A website that builds you a website. And what does that actually mean? Well, for one thing, it blocks off people who come into the community. There's a load of people that used to download Drupal, put up their own little blog site on some shared hosting, and they would join the community because they were wanting to develop their own websites. Those people don't exist anymore because they'll just go to Wix or Squarespace, and then they'll become a part of those communities instead. So we now don't have those sort of early young adopters coming in, which means we don't have people really interested in hobbyist type Drupaling anymore. Most of the people that come to Drupal community actually get paid to build these sites, and so that's why we run conferences on a weekday where you're paid to be here, opposed to the weekend when you're not. So Drupal's not really a hobbyist thing anymore. It's more of a professional tool, and that's because the SaaS world has really eaten up that small to medium space. Then you've got the mid-market. Oh, wow, man. Long talk. Okay, so mid-market space is still kind of there a little bit, right? But it's closing out. There's a lot more competition going in there. And the SaaS space is all about commodity. So as they continue to solve complex problems and apply them to the mid-market, they'll continue to eat up the food chain, right? Enterprise, however, they're still in the 2001 licensing model, right? They're dealing with people like Adobe and Sitecore who are still selling them perpetual licenses. So we can actually still compete in that space with the business models that they're still using and have used since 2001, and it's still applicable for giving the open source spiel to the enterprise and winning those contracts. Exactly what Akwe has been doing, but it also means working with the bigger people. Like, it's a bigger market, so there's bigger players, and like people like Deloitte Digital, Sapient Razorfish, Capgemini. They're all tier 1 vendors in that space, and they do a whole lot more in the world of delivering value to customers than what we do as Drupal Dev Shops. But they don't actually have Drupal capabilities, right? So they're happy to take on Drupal because it's eating their market share, but they actually need the help from the dev shops to be able to deliver on that. So here is some strategy or just some sort of food for thought about ways that we can, now that I've kind of painted the Armageddon picture of where we're kind of heading as an industry from how do you guys continue to be profitable in the business models that you have? Well, what are some food for thought for what your business model should be? Number one, as I mentioned before, is we need to continue development of Drupal 8 to actually get it to that feature complete state. It's not quite ready yet for the backend developers to just kind of walk away from it. We still need to actually have a bunch of things ready for, like a great example, we had a pen test done on a site, but the penetration testers came back and said, when you need to do a password reset, it sends an email, and then you click the link, and then you can reset your password. Well, if your email account gets hacked, now you can get access to your CMS, and that's a problem. What you need to do is you need to insert some security questions, or you need to have two-factor authentication before you give access back to that person. I was like, well, okay, how do we go about doing that? Well, there is the security questions module, and it's available in Drupal 7, but it's unstable in Drupal 8. So if I add it to my project, I have no guarantee that functionality is going to break at a later date. It's kind of a problem because it means I can't, get that sort of enterprise tick in the Drupal 8 space. So those are kind of the small examples where we kind of just need to make that contra module area much more stable so that we can quickly solve those types of problems in the enterprise. Another one is partnerships. So as I mentioned earlier, you saw the Martech 5000. There are loads of companies around, and actually the customer needs a group of those to be able to create a solution. And so they have a solution which is delivering personalized content to their end user, and you can actually have a partnership of people that can help you go about doing that. Partnerships are great because you both get a win-win, you both win market share, and you often can compete at, like clip the ticket or, get some sort of cash back for being able to, and also at the same time, appear as a much more complete provider. So you do the Drupal component, maybe someone else does, I don't know, the WAF, the CDN, or someone else does the personalization engine component, and it just looks like a more complete offering to the customer. They love that kind of one channel because procurement costs them a lot of effort, and they want to know that things work together as well. So they love partnerships. Getting lean. So there might be some things inside of your organization that you do well, and there might be some things in your organization that you don't do so well. So there's this idea of when you're a mature practice, those things that are mature inside your practice are actually strong processes, and those strong processes are usually supported by strong opinions. So you could say that being mature is about having some strong opinions about how you go about doing some things. So if you look inside your organization to say, what are the strong opinions that give us a market advantage, and what are some of the weaker opinions or strong opinions that don't give us a market advantage? And those might be some things you might want to look at and say, well, maybe we don't need to hold opinions about that anymore. Actually, maybe we could use someone else's opinion to basically streamline that process for us. There's actually loads of those opinions around. What's going on here? Oh, there we go. Loads of opinions around. So don't reinvent, right? So there is actually, for example, we recognize at Acquia that there are loads of different ways of managing a Drupal site. And if you do projects over and over and over again, why do you have to reinvent the wheel of how you do that every single time? There can be actually an opinionated way of doing this that just makes it streamlined. And if you do that consistently, it makes everything easier. It creates a opinionated way of educating people as well. So we released a tool set called BLT, and we encourage all of our partners to build with that tool set. And in doing so, it's easier to support them. It's easier for them to get up to scratch really quickly. Some of our partners have never done Drupal before. And it means that they're like, great, we can actually get bootstrapped so much quicker. And then it's an open community project, so other people can basically share their opinions into it, and the community can decide the leanest way of doing that. And finally, I think the sort of area for a whole lot of new market is what I call headless UI, which is basically everything that Preston was talking about this morning. The idea that actually, you know, a lot of guys that we have in our teams are PHP guys, they're back-end guys. They might not necessarily want to get back involved. Like, I originally got away from the front end because I hated the idea of doing cross-browser testing. And I hate the idea of ever actually going back in there and saying, well, now that the browsers are better, I'm going to do front end. I don't want to do that because it just goes back to like having to deal with lots of different devices. I love the idea of just writing a single line of code and knowing it works everywhere. So, you know, there's actually a lot of people that want to stay in there, and those guys are, you know, inside your teams. Then headless UI is actually a really cool area to reach out and branch out into. It means that the future for you is not necessarily websites. It could be, you know, chatbots, for example, is a good example of a headless UI, because it's a, you know, a RESTful service that you're interacting with. There's loads of SaaS applications out there, you know, the beacons, the, you know, augmented reality. There's loads of stuff, and working with those teams and creating these kind of like headless applications, I think is probably more likely the future that we would be heading into, that keeps, you know, Drupal relevant and your dev shops relevant, than we are about, you know, continuing to build website after website as we have done for the past few years. So that's my talk. I've got 5 minutes for anyone who's got a question. I know it's kind of a little bit of a controversial topic, so I'd love to hear some feedback if you have any. Oh yeah, sure. At the back there. Yeah, so I mean, the easiest example of thinking about headless UI would be like a Slack channel, right? So I integrate a Drupal site to go talk to the Slack channel, and then I talk to that bot by issuing text commands in Slack. So I'm not actually interfacing with a web browser, not surfing HTML, not rendering CSS, JavaScript, all that sort of thing to actually integrate, but I'm still talking to a bot, which is actually Drupal doing lookups to content in the back end, and it's bringing me back answers. So if I'm a developer, who am I working with to do that stuff? So I think like Slack is actually, you know, sort of taking the market by storm in a lot of ways, right? Lots of organizations, not just technical ones, are adopting Slack as a means of communicating. I already noticed when we adopted it, I immediately started using less email. I thought it was a more convenient way of contacting certain people in certain situations. And the bots that come in there are really assistive to helping the organization move as one. So there is this whole new market that, you know, as a dev shop who used to think about, I'm going to respond to an RFP about, you know, delivering a website. Well, when someone's actually asking for an intranet, can you bake Slack into your solution and suggest that as a part of your deployment tool? And the CMS is more of a content store, and then you're delivering the value to the organization. Now, that's kind of almost transformational, right? Like, transformational is really more of a cultural aspect than it is a technological one. But the culture of stopping to go to a website and moving to a Slack channel for information is the transformational component. And that's a lot of thought leadership that you provide as a dev shop into that organization to help them transition through what we would call the broader term of digital transformation, which all these industries are going through at the same time as well. Is that cool? Are there any other questions? What about pretty front-end website? So the back-end dev hasn't typically cared about the pretty front-end stuff, right? So you have the front-end devs who are really obsessed over that. The traditional model has been where you get some guys who mock up some sites in Photoshop or something. They get approved by the customer. The Drupal developers cut that up into Drupal, and then you have front-end themers who theme that, and then Drupal serves those pages. That's the traditional model. But in the new model, where a lot more of the logic's held on the front end, Drupal's responsible for delivering just the content, and it's usually over a JSON format opposed to an HTML format. So there's more decoupled movement there, and so you have different practice. And what ends up happening is the front-end developers are front-end developers, not just front-end themers. So they're a lot more comprehensive in that area, and they hold a lot more decision-making than they used to in the old model. But it's also a new skill set. So my argument here is that the back-end PHP developer doesn't necessarily have an interest in learning, how to use node modules, for example. So I think there's a different thing altogether. Si? Cool. Any other questions? No? Thank you very much.